Hello, and welcome to episode 6, or chapter 6, or week 6 of American Environmental History. Today we're going to talk about the transportation revolution. The transportation revolution in the United States really began when Americans who had been taking advantage of the features of the natural environment to move people and things from place to place started looking for ways to make transport cheaper and faster and more efficient. And over time, a series of technological changes allowed transport to advance to the point where machines have effectively conquered distance. People can almost effortlessly travel to anywhere in the world and can inexpensively ship raw materials and products across a global market. Although this image kind of looks like abstract art, it's really a chart of world air travel routes in 2009. So the technology has come to that point. But we should know that the technology is not ubiquitous across the world, and it's not necessarily democratic. As a famous science fiction writer, William Gibson, once remarked, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. Modern transportation infrastructure is controlled to a great extent by large corporations. But the benefits of transport are depended on by everybody. And transportation technology itself requires specific conditions like abundant, cheap, portable energy in the form of fossil fuels, and public infrastructure created by our own and by foreign governments that even those large corporations depend on but don't actually control. So when we think of transportation, it's natural to think first about going places. The idea that we can get on a plane in one hemisphere and get off in another, or on the other side of the world after a few hours, is a life-changing opportunity that was unavailable to most people as little as a generation ago, and it was unthinkable to people 2 generations ago. But more crucial to our daily lives than the freedom that's offered by this potential for world travel is the cargo from the other side of the world that reaches us quickly in the holds of jets, and more slowly, but in almost unimaginable volume in containers carried on ships. The global transportation of foods and raw materials and finished goods goes virtually unnoticed in our daily lives today, but it makes our contemporary consumer lifestyle possible. As we've already seen, early Americans from prehistoric times onward have made amazing journeys with very primitive methods of transportation. The people who crossed Beringia and settled in North and South America were able to cover startlingly long distances on foot. European explorers crossed dangerous oceans to visit the Americas in tiny ships. Human and animal power has been used extensively throughout American history and is still used today to reach remote areas off the grid. But it's clear that improvements in transportation technology have been among the most powerful drivers of change in American history. And the transportation revolution has certainly changed our relationship with the American environment. So let's look at that. Technological improvements in ocean-going ships in the 15th century made European colonialism possible in the first place. Ships became bigger and faster and safer. More people and more goods could leave the safety of coastal waters and cross whole oceans. And the places that these improved ships connected became centers of trade and population and wealth. This pattern of growth repeated itself as new technologies were developed to help Americans expand across the continent. As we've seen, American colonists depended on trade with England and then with the sugar planters in the West Indies to make their outposts in New England and Virginia successful. But from the beginning of the American Revolution to the conclusion of the War of 1812, relations between the new American nation and Britain were tense and trade suffered. If it had not found a way to ship people and goods to and from its own frontier, the United States would have remained a coastal nation focused on ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. The barely remembered Whiskey Rebellion of 1791, when George Washington actually led U.S. troops against American farmers in western Pennsylvania, was really about transportation. Farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains could not easily haul wagon loads of grain that they harvested to eastern markets. So they turned their harvests into a more portable product by distilling grain into whiskey. The farmers believed that the government's excise tax of 7.5 cents per gallon on distilled spirits had been instituted to drive them out of the whiskey business for the benefit of large Eastern distillers. Since they had very few other sources of income, the tax was a serious issue for Westerners. Luckily, the incoming Jefferson administration repealed the tax in 1801, and increasing Ohio River shipping provided new outlets down the Mississippi River to New Orleans for Western produce. On the eve of the American Revolution, the only road that didn't hug the East Coast followed the Hudson River to the Mohawk River and then went west into western New York on its way to Montreal. And this was one reason why colonial Americans seemed to be continually obsessed with the idea of conquering Canada, taking Montreal and bringing it into the United States. Less than 30 years later, in the New Republic, riders working for the Post Office Department carried mail to nearly all the new settlements in the interior. The postal system's designer was Benjamin Franklin, and he understood that in order for the New Republic to function, information had to flow freely. Franklin set a very low rate for mailing newspapers, which ensured that the news would circulate widely into these newly settled areas. But it was one thing carrying saddlebags filled with letters and newspapers to the frontier, and it was something completely different moving people and freight. Rivers were the first important routes into the interior of North America. The Ohio River, which begins at Pittsburgh, where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet, where Fort Pitt used to be, and before that, Fort Duquesne, when the French held it. This helped people get to their new farms in the Ohio River Valley, and it helped them carry their farm produce to markets. The Ohio River Valley became one of the first areas of rapid settlement after the Revolution, along with the Mohawk River Valley in western New York. The importance of river shipping is illustrated by the fact that over 50,000 miles of tributary rivers and streams in the Mississippi watershed were used to float goods to the port of New Orleans. The dependence of these Western farmers on that Spanish port also helps explain why New Orleans was considered a strategic city by the United States in the War of 1812. Thomas Jefferson's 1803 purchase of the Louisiana Territory had actually begun as an attempt to buy just the city of New Orleans. And Andrew Jackson's defense of the city during the War of 1812 was vital to ensuring the success and the continuation of this western expansion. So early westward expansion depended on these rivers, and towns and cities that were built during this era were usually on a waterway. Pittsburgh, Columbus, Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis, Kansas City, Omaha, and St. Paul all owe their locations to the river systems that they provide access to. Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee use the Great Lakes in the same way. These lakeside cities exploded after the Erie Canal opened and created a route from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic through the canal and then through the Hudson River. And that allowed New York, actually, and New York Harbor to overtake New Orleans as the nation's most important commercial port. The 363-mile Erie Canal was so successful that another 4,000 miles of canals were dug in America before the Civil War. In 1800, it took nearly 2 weeks to reach Buffalo from New York City. It took a month to get to Detroit, and it took 6 grueling weeks of travel to arrive at the swampy lakeshore settlement that would later become Chicago. 30 years later, Buffalo was just 5 days away, Detroit was about 10 days, and Chicago was less than 3 weeks. Horses pulled canal boats from towpaths on the shore, and that eliminated the strain of travel for the boat's passengers. Floating along a calm waterway was infinitely more comfortable than spending weeks on a wagon, bumping along, or in a cramped stagecoach, or on horseback. The number of people willing to make long trips increased accordingly. And the amount of freight shipped to New York after the canal cut shipping costs by over 90% increased astronomically. Goods flowed along the canal in both directions, offering life-changing opportunities on the frontier. Within 10 years after the Erie Canal's completion, the last fulling mill that processed homespun cloth for farm wives who made homespun cloth in Western New York shut its doors. Women no longer had to spend all their time spinning wool and weaving their own textiles to make their families' clothing. They could easily buy bolts of wool and cotton fabrics from the same merchant at the local general store who probably ground their family's grain and into flour and then put it in barrels and shipped it along the canal to eastern cities. With fewer demands on their time, a lot of women were then able to not only improve their own quality of life, but to contribute to the family income by taking on piecework, by raising cash crops, or by keeping cows and churning butter for sale to the local merchants. Steam technology changed the nature of transportation. Until steam engines were put on riverboats, shipping had depended on either wind or on river currents, or on human and animal power, pulling flat-bottom boats in canals. Goods could easily be floated south from farms on America's rivers, but it was much more difficult and expensive to ship products against the river's currents out to the frontier. Flatboats and rafts actually accumulated at downstream ports, where they were broken down and burned as firewood. Steam engines made it possible to sail upstream as easily and nearly as quickly as it was to sail down, which caused an explosion of travel and shipping and radically changed frontier life. Steam engines were a product of early European industrialism. The first steam patent was actually granted to a Spanish inventor named Geronimo Beaumont in 1606. And the engine was used to drive a pump to drain mines. Mines, as they were dug deeper, often ran into water, so you needed pumps to draw the water out. And a steam engine was a much more efficient way than human power or animal power. Later, Englishman James Watt's 1781 engine was the first one to produce rotary power that could be adapted to drive mills or wheels or propellers. Robert Fulton, an American inventor who had previously patented a canal dredging machine, visited Paris and caught steamboat fever. Fulton sailed an experimental model on the Seine in Paris, and then he returned home and launched the first commercial American steamboat on the Hudson River in 1807. The Clermont was able to sail 150 miles from New York City upriver to Albany in 32 hours. In 1811, Fulton built the New Orleans in Pittsburgh on the Ohio River and sailed it down the Ohio to New Orleans, beginning steamboat service on the Mississippi. Fulton died a couple of years later, died young, but his partners, who included the Roosevelts, continued the Mississippi River service and made their fortunes. Like Fulton's prototype, the Clermont, the New Orleans had been a large, heavy side wheeler with a deep draft. It had been an old-fashioned boat with paddle wheels on the sides. It wasn't the most efficient design for shallow water. And it didn't take long for the shipbuilders, especially along the Mississippi, to settle on the familiar shallow draft rear paddle riverboats that carried freight on the Mississippi River and its tributaries well into the 20th century. The shallower a riverboat's draft, the less water it displaces, the farther upriver it could travel. Steam-powered riverboats soon pushed the transportation frontier to Fort Pierre, which was later Pierre in the Dakota Territory, and even to Fort Benton in Montana. Riverboats made it possible to ship goods in and out of nearly the whole area that Thomas Jefferson had acquired from the French in the Louisiana Purchase just a generation earlier. And steam-powered ocean shipping made it possible to reach markets in Britain and Europe and make them accessible to farmers and merchants from the middle of North America. America's first small railroads had actually been built on the East Coast before the steam engine was even available to power them. Trains of cars were pulled by horses, and they looked a lot like a train of stagecoaches on rails. But after Englishman George Stephenson's locomotives began pulling passengers and freight in the coal country of northwestern England in the mid-1820s, Americans quickly switched to steam. The first locomotive that was used to pull cars in the United States was the Tom Thumb, and that was built in 1829-1830 for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Although the Tom Thumb lost its maiden race against a horse-drawn train, the B&O railroad owners were convinced by the demonstration of steam technology, and they committed to developing steam engines. The railroad, the B&O Railroad, which had been established in 1827 to compete with the Erie Canal, already advertised itself as a faster way to move people and freight from the interior to the coast. And then adding steam engines, of course, accelerated rail's advantage over canal and river shipping. Over 9,000 miles of track were laid by 1850, most of it connecting the Northeast with western farmlands. The Mississippi River was still the preferred route to the market from Louisville and St. Louis south. But Cincinnati and Columbus actually became connected by rail to the Great Lakes, to the ports at Sandusky and Cleveland, which gave the northern Ohio River Valley faster access to New York markets, which was where the money was. Detroit and Lake Michigan were also connected by rail, making the long steamboat trip around the northern part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula unnecessary. By 1857, rail travelers who had once taken weeks could now reach Chicago in less than 2 days and could be almost anywhere else in the northern Mississippi River Valley in 3 days. On the eve of the Civil War in 1860, Chicago was already becoming the railroad hub of the Midwest. The Illinois Central Railroad Company had been chartered in 1851 to build a rail line from the lead mines at Galena to Cairo, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers joined. Galena was also located on the Mississippi River, actually, at the northern border of Illinois. But the rapids north of St. Louis made transporting ore on the river impossible. And that illustrates the advantage of rails over rivers. A railroad line to Cairo, with a branch line to Chicago, would also attract settlers and investors to Illinois. A young attorney by the name of Abraham Lincoln helped the Illinois Central lobby legislators and receive the first land grant ever given to a railroad company. The company was given 2.6 million acres of land, and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who later ran against Lincoln for president, helped to design the checkerboard distribution of parcels that would become common for railroad land grants. The Illinois Central Railroad Company would, a few years later, show its gratitude by helping to finance Lincoln's presidential campaign against Douglas. The North's advantage over the Confederate South in railroad miles and the Union Army's ability to move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently had a definite impact on the outcome of the Civil War. In the years following the war, the South was shattered, and very little railroad track was repaired. Only a small percentage of the tracks were left after the Union Army spent most of its time destroying Southern railroad tracks. So while railroads languished in the South, rail miles in the North exploded. In 1862, the Lincoln administration had passed the Pacific Railroad Act, and in 1869, the West Coast was finally connected through Chicago and St. Louis to the Northeast, when the Union and the Central Pacific lines met at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10th, 1869. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad made it possible for people to travel by rail across the nation instead of having to go by foot as they had to do during the gold rush, or to take a ship all the way around the bottom of South America and up the west coast of both of the continents, which was not only time consuming, but also not particularly safe. The Pacific Railroad Act was actually the first law that allowed the federal government to give land directly to corporations. So the Lincoln administration has a role in the growth of corporations as well. So previously, the government had granted land to the states, and then the states had given land to the corporations. So it had been a more involved process. But the Pacific Railroad Act actually granted 10 square miles of land to the railroad companies, to the corporations, for every mile of track that they built. Land next to railroads always increased in value. That was the point. And this unprecedented gift of 10 square miles of rapidly appreciating land for every mile of track was a tremendous incentive to the railroad companies to lay just as much track as they possibly could. So decisions to build rail lines were frequently based on the land that was going to be granted, rather than on any calculation of whether or not the companies expected the new lines to carry enough traffic or enough freight to ever justify them economically, right? So it wasn't a question of revenue, it was a question of land. So in the 18 years between the original Illinois Central land grant in 1851 and the completion of the Transcontinental Line in 1869, privately owned railroads received about 175 million acres of public land at no cost. This amounts to about 7% of the land area of the contiguous 48 states. Or in other words, a piece of land slightly bigger than the state of Texas. For comparison, the Homestead Act, which was also passed in 1862 to provide land for farmers, distributed 246 million acres of land. So it did distribute more land to American farmers. But it took 72 years to do that, from 1862 to 1934. And it required homesteaders to live on and to farm the land continuously for 5 years, or to give back their parcel or pay for it. Right? The justification for this residency requirement was that the government was concerned that homesteaders would become speculators and would flip their farms. The railroad land grants didn't have any stipulations like that because obviously the railroad corporations were expected to sell the lands that they were given at a substantial profit. That was the whole point. It's often been argued that a national infrastructure project as big as a transcontinental railway could never have been built without government assistance. The West Coast and the Western territories needed to be brought into the Union, some historians have argued. And the only way to achieve that was with these big government-supported railroads. Ironically, the same people who make this argument usually also claim that it would have been disastrous for the government to have owned the railroads that it had made possible with this legislation and with these loans and with these land grants. An undertaking of this scope and scale, they say, requires that corporations have to be given monopolies and have to be given grants of public land and natural resources and public credit. These arguments make it seem inevitable that giant corporations taking huge gifts of public sector resources and land are the only way for America to move forward and build a rail network. However, history shows that this was not the only way that a rail system could be built, even one that crosses the entire nation. Now, there are a lot of examples of rail systems built and managed by the public sector in foreign countries, especially during the 19th century, when nearly every rail system outside the United States was state-owned and operated. However, for the sake of simplicity, we'll restrict our comparison to just the United States, and we'll compare two railroad systems. The Northern Pacific Railroad, which was a private corporation that was chartered by Congress in 1864, built 6,800 miles of track to connect Lake Superior with Puget Sound. In return, the corporation was given 40 million acres of land in 50-mile checkerboards on either side of its tracks. Not only did the Northern Pacific rely on the government for land and financing, the railroad also used the services of the U.S. Army to protect its surveyors and to remove uncooperative Indians who were in its way. When the Northern Pacific's proposed route cut through the center of the Great Sioux Reservation, which had been established in 1868 at the Fort Laramie Treaty, the corporation pressured the government to break the treaty. George Custer, who was an employee of the railroad, announced that gold had been discovered in the Black Hills after a trip out there in 1874 when he was protecting Northern Pacific surveyors. And then Washington let the treaty be disregarded by both the railroad and by the prospectors. The Indians responded with the Great Sioux War of 1876, which culminated in the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer and his 7th Cavalry were wiped out by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who led a force of Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors. But although the Indians won the battle, they lost the war. Less than a year later, the Sioux leaders ceded the Black Hills to the United States in exchange for subsistence rations for their families on the reservation. In contrast, Canadian-American railroad entrepreneur James Jerome Hill built his Great Northern Railroad from St. Paul to Seattle during the last decades of the 19th century without causing a war and without receiving a single acre of free public land. The Great Northern bought land from the government to build its right-of-way and to resell to settlers. Hill claimed proudly that his railroad was completed, quote, without any government aid, even the right-of-way, through hundreds of miles of public lands being paid for in cash, end quote. The Great Northern System connected the Northwest with the rest of the nation through St. Paul, using a web of over 8,300 miles of track. And because J.J. Hill only built lines where the traffic justified them, rather than just adding track where he could collect free land, the Great Northern was one of the few transcontinental railroad companies to avoid bankruptcy in the Panic of 1893. So regardless of the ways that they were financed and built, though, the proliferation of railroads caused explosive growth. Chicago was a frontier village of 4,500 people in 1840. When Lincoln helped the Illinois Central receive its first land grant in 1851, the city's population had risen to about 30,000. 20 years later, Chicago was the center of a rapidly growing railroad network, and the city had 10 times as many people, had 300,000. In 1880, Chicago's population was over 500,000, and 10 years later, Chicago had over 1 million residents. We'll take a closer look at the changes that the railroads brought to Chicago in the next chapter, actually. America's transportation revolution didn't end, though, with steamboats and railroads. And it wasn't limited to public transportation technologies. The development of the automobile ushered in a new era of personal mobility for Americans. Internal combustion engines were inexpensive to mass produce and much easier to operate than steam engines. With the development of automobiles and trucks around the turn of the 20th century, it no longer required a huge capital investment and a team of engineers to purchase and operate motorized transportation. Even the workers on Henry Ford's assembly lines could aspire to owning their own Model Ts, especially after Ford doubled their wages to $5 a day in January of 1914. Engineers had experimented with building smaller machines using steam engines, and there were several examples in Europe and America of successful steam-powered farm tractors, trucks, and even a few horseless carriages. But internal combustion engines delivered much greater power relative to their mass, which allowed smaller machines to do more work. The first internal combustion farm tractor was built by a guy named John Froelich at his small Waterloo gasoline traction engine company in Waterloo, Iowa in 1892. Others began applying internal combustion to farm equipment, and between 1907 and 1912, the number of tractors in America's fields rose from about 600 to about 13,000. 80 companies manufactured more than 20,000 tractors in 1913. After an auspicious beginning, Froelic's own little Iowa company grew slowly and began to build farm tractors in volume only after World War I. The Waterloo Company built a good product, and it was acquired by the John Deere Plow Company in 1918. Deere tractors took off, they started painting them green, and they became the world leader in self-propelled farm equipment. The first internal combustion truck was built by Gottlieb Daimler in 1896, using an engine that had been developed by Carl Benz a year earlier. World War I spurred innovation and provided a ready market for internal combustion trucks that were much less expensive than their steam-powered rivals. By the end of the war, gasoline-powered trucks had overtaken the steam truck market, and most large trucks now burn diesel rather than gasoline, using a compression ignition engine design that was patented by Rudolf Diesel in 1892. So internal combustion trucks and tractors, like cars, allowed people to go farther, carry more, and do more work than had been possible using human and animal power, or even steam power. And they were much more affordable and easier to run than steam-powered vehicles, and easier to build at a scale that encouraged lots of individual use and ownership. Trucking eventually challenged rail transport, especially after the development of semi-trailers and the interstate highway system, which I'll mention momentarily. Although the first diesel truck engines only produced 5 to 7 horsepower, they advanced quickly. Indiana mechanic Plessy Cummins built his first 6-horsepower diesel engine in 1919. The business that bears his name is now a global corporation doing $20 billion in annual business, mostly in diesel engines. Cummins' current heavy truck engine is rated at 600 horsepower. Now, while it's easy to focus on the inventions and the technological innovations of the internal combustion era, we shouldn't lose sight of the infrastructure improvements that made these innovations valuable. Without paved roads to run on, there wouldn't have been as many cars and trucks, and their impact on society and the environment would have been very different. The biggest road building project in American history was the construction of the Interstate Highway System, which was financed by the Federal Aid Highway Acts of 1944 and 1956. Now, unlike the Transcontinental Railroad project of the 1860s, the Interstate Highway System was paid for by federal government funds, and the roads were turned over to the states and are now owned by the states. The system includes nearly 47,000 miles of highway, and the project was designed to be self-liquidating so that the cost of the system did not contribute to the national debt. In addition to the interstate system, American states and counties and cities and towns maintain systems of roads totaling nearly 4 million miles, about 2/3 of which are paved. Now, the economic trade-off of internal combustion for farmers and teamsters, truck drivers, who first adopted it was that speed and power came at a price. Right? Where horses and oxen had been readily available in farm communities and were cheap to maintain, tractors and trucks were a substantial investment. And unlike horses and oxen, tractors and trucks needed to be fueled with petroleum that made them dependent on a faraway industry. However, this dependence was not inevitable. It didn't have to be that way. Henry Ford and Charles Kettering, who had been the chief engineer of General Motors, had both believed that as engine compression ratios increased, their company's engines would transition from kerosene and gasoline to ethyl alcohol. We're all aware that the shift to ethanol didn't happen, but why it didn't is less well known and may surprise you. Most history books faithfully repeat the inaccurate story that Edwin Drake's famous 1858 or 1859 oil strike in Titusville, Pennsylvania came just as the world was running out of expensive whale oil. Actually, that's wrong in two ways. The Russians began drilling oil in Azerbaijan in the 1840s, and actually there was a thriving market for alcohol fuel in the mid-19th century in the United States. Ethanol was price competitive with kerosene, and unlike kerosene, it was produced by many small distillers, which created widespread competition that would continue to drive down prices. Unfortunately for ethanol producers and for fuel consumers, the alcohol fuel industry was wiped out by the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, when Lincoln imposed a $2.08 per gallon tax on distilled alcohol between 1862 and 1864. A gallon of Standard Oil kerosene continued to cost only 58 cents. So kerosene took over the American fuel market. Of course, after kerosene became the only available fuel, Standard Oil was free to raise the price as they saw fit. But ethanol still had its advocates. The very first American internal combustion engine, which had been built in 1826 by Samuel Morey, had used grain alcohol because it was inexpensive and readily available. And nearly a century later, Henry Ford's Model T was designed to be convertible between kerosene, gasoline, and ethanol. General Motors' chief engineer, Kettering, was convinced that it was only a matter of time until ethanol became the fuel of choice. So why didn't it? Why aren't we all driving cars running renewable fuels today? Well, part of the answer, as you probably already guessed, is that Standard Oil made the auto industry an offer they couldn't refuse. The oil company used its vast distribution network to make gasoline available everywhere that it was needed, and it ensured that the price was so low that competitors couldn't profit if they entered the market. Standard Oil pioneered the practice of pricing below their cost of production to run their competitors out of business. The profits of the company's other divisions subsidized their short-term losses on gasoline. Predatory pricing was just one of the many charges that were made against the company in 1911 in the antitrust case that resulted in the breakup of the Standard Oil Trust. But Standard Oil's predatory pricing doesn't tell the whole story of why we're not driving around in cars run by ethanol. The rest of the story, if anything, is even more sinister. It had long been known that using gasoline at high compression resulted in engine knocking. It was also well known that ethanol didn't have that problem. Running ethanol didn't create engine knocking. Charles Kettering at General Motors had argued for years that, and I'll quote him, he said, "The most direct route which we know for converting energy from its source, the sun, into a material suitable for use as a fuel is through vegetation to alcohol." End quote. So the technology was simple. Distilling technology had been around forever. Americans had been distilling alcohol for fuel and for drinking and for other uses for generations. Unfortunately, Kettering worked for a corporation whose major shareholder was the DuPont family, who also happened to own the largest chemical corporation in America. It would be impossible for DuPont to profit or for General Motors to gain a competitive advantage using alcohol fuels, since the distilling technology was universally available and the product was unpatentable. However, there was an extremely profitable and patentable alternative. Tetraethyl lead, or TEL, was a lubricating compound that could be added to gasoline to eliminate knocking. General Motors received a patent on its use as an anti-knock agent, and Standard Oil was granted a patent on its manufacture, and that patent was later extended to include DuPont. The three companies founded the Ethyl Corporation to market TEL and other fuel additives. Unfortunately, lead is a powerful neurotoxin. It's linked to learning disabilities and to dementia in adults. The federal government had misgivings about allowing lead additives, and in 1925, The Surgeon General actually temporarily suspended TEL's use, and government scientists secretly approached Ford engineers looking for an alternative. In the 1930s, 19 federal bills and 31 state bills were introduced to promote alcohol use or blending. But the American Petroleum Industries Committee lobbied hard against them. Under intense industry pressure, the Federal Trade Commission even issued a restraining order forbidding commercial competitors from criticizing ethyl gasoline as unsafe. By the mid-1930s, 90% of all gasoline contained TEL. Airborne lead pollution increased over 625 times previous background levels. And the average IQ levels of American children dropped 7 points during the leaded gas era. By the 1980s, over 50 million American children registered toxic levels of lead absorption, and 5,000 Americans died annually of lead-induced heart disease. When public concern continued to increase, the Ethyl Corporation was sold in 1962 in the largest leveraged buyout of its time. In the 1970s, the newly established Environmental Protection Agency finally took the stand that all the other federal agencies had been afraid to take. The EPA declared emphatically that airborne lead posed a serious threat to public health. And the government forced automakers and the fuel industry to gradually eliminate the use of lead. TEL is now illegal in automotive gasoline, although it's still used in aviation and in racing fuels. Unleaded gasoline is now used in all new internal combustion cars. But while pure ethanol has powered most of the automobiles in Brazil since the 1970s, most Americans continue to use a blend that contains just 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline. The two additional forms of transportation that became increasingly important as the 20th century ended and the 21st century began were commercial airlines and container shipping. Commercial air travel had begun only a little over 100 years ago, and the first air cargo and air mail shipments were flown in 1910 and 1911, respectively. Air cargo was considered too expensive for all but the most valuable shipments until express carriers like UPS and Federal Express revolutionized the shipping business in the 1990s. The global economy now measures air freight volumes in ton miles. In 2014, world shipping exceeded 58 billion ton miles of goods. Air freight also allows perishable items like fresh fruits and vegetables from South America to be transported across oceans and continents from producers to consumers. This is big business. Over 75 million tons of fresh produce are air-shipped annually, worth more than $50 billion. For non-perishable items, container shipping has created a single global market. Standardized containers were invented by a trucker named Malcolm McLean, who realized it would save a lot of time and money if his trucks didn't need to be loaded and unloaded every time they got to port, but could just be hoisted on and off a cargo ship. McLean bought and refitted an oil tanker and made his first trip in 1956, carrying 58 containers from Newark to Houston. Current annual shipping now exceeds 200 million semi-trailer size containers. Containers can be shipped by sea, rail, truck, and even air, allowing just-in-time operators like Walmart to manage a supply chain that relies very much less on warehoused inventory and more on product in transit. So most of their warehouses are actually trucks that are making their way from place to place across America's highways. But just as shifting from horsepower to a gasoline truck or a tractor 100 years ago involved economic trade-offs, shopping at Walmart today introduces a new level of dependence. We're not only relying now on transportation systems and the fuels that they run on, but also on supply chain software, international trade agreements, currency fluctuations, and even on the political situations of faraway nations. As long as the costs of inputs like fuel and infrastructure like ports and highways and open borders as long as all those costs remain low, then the global market is a great deal for the consumer and a source of immense profits to businesses and their shareholders. But a company like Walmart is just as dependent on factors that it can't control as its customers are. And if any of these factors change, who's going to cover the cost? Next time, as I said, we will look at Chicago specifically and use that kind of as a case study for urbanization and change. But that is all for today. So thanks for listening. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you again next time.